The Rana Plaza collapsed on the 24th of April 2013. The building had been closed by police the previous day after cracks had appeared in the wall. But the owners of the various factories housed in the building hired their own inspectors and cleared the building for work. Under threat of losing their jobs, the workers crammed into the building. Some only arrived at their stations 1 hour before the building collapsed. More than 1,100 people died in the collapse, and 2,000 more were wounded. It was the worst industrial accident in the history of the garment industry. Among the international brands who had subcontracted work to the factories in the Rana Plaza were Walmart, JCPenney, and Primark. 5 months earlier, another factory in Bangladesh, Tazreen Fashions, caught fire. As alarms rang out in the building, employees were instructed to continue working. Those who tried to flee found themselves locked in by management. More than 100 people died in the accident. Tazreen Fashions was producing for Walmart, Sears, and Disney. The massive human cost of these incidents caused a public relations disaster for the international brands producing their clothes in Bangladeshi sweatshops. The ultimate result of the outcry was the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a binding legal agreement between international and Bangladeshi unions on the one hand and 180 apparel corporations on the other. As a result, thousands of factory inspections were performed and hundreds of factories were closed due to non-compliance with safety regulations. Altogether, this would seem to be a success story for corporate social responsibility. A tragedy happens, public outcry, followed by a general improvement in working conditions. But while the Accord did improve safety conditions in some garment factories, it did nothing to resolve the underlying problem. As one 2015 report from the International Labour Organization points out, the social impetus that collapsed the Rana Plaza and set fire to Tazreen Fashions was an economic race to the bottom, wherein Bangladeshi manufacturers adopted strategies to systematically reduce production costs by squeezing wages and expenditure on new factory building and safety measures. The Accord does demand that international brands will negotiate fair pricing with their suppliers, but unlike with factory inspections, there is no enforcement mechanism in the Accord for this. As a result, the laborers who produce the clothes we wear work in some of the worst conditions on earth for poverty wages. The minimum wage, last raised in 2018, is fixed at 8,000 Bangladeshi taka, the nominal equivalent of $73 a month. A recent study on the working conditions of Bangladeshi laborers found that they lacked clean drinking water, had overcrowded and inadequate seating arrangements, as well as unsanitary conditions in their workplaces, among other unacceptable workplace conditions. The highest salary of all the workers interviewed was 14,500 Bangladeshi taka, or $167 per month. As the surveyor notes, this is very low to lead a decent life in an urban/semi-urban setting where the majority of the ready-made garment factories are located. Perhaps the most difficult to read section in this report are descriptions of workplace safety. The participants stated that they lived in fear of a workplace emergency, such as a fire or building collapse. For those of us who live in the global north, the Rana Plaza or Tazreen Fashions incidents are tragic but transient. In Bangladesh, however, these incidents live on in the minds of garment workers who describe their workplaces as death traps. One says, "We work in fear. We start to work keeping in mind that our factory building may collapse and we may be found as dead, like the fellow Rana Plaza workers." They stated that they are afraid they would be unable to use emergency exits in the case of a fire, adding that they were often locked by management or otherwise obstructed. The factory gates and floors as well always remain locked. As one of the workers interviewed describes, many workers die almost every year for being stuck inside factories during a fire. "I fear I may also die by such a fire in my factory as all the exit gates remained locked." All of this is of no consequence for multinational corporations. Every cent shaved off of a worker's wage, every safety violation that would take money to fix, represent higher profits for them. Bangladesh's garment sector is overwhelmingly oriented towards exports to the global north. In 2011, shortly before the collapse of Rana Plaza, 85% of Bangladesh's garment exports were sent for sale in the United States and the European Union. Today, in 2023, the equivalent figure stands at 81%. Much of what we consume today is produced by workers laboring in terrible conditions. The clothes we wear, the food we consume, the electronics we find indispensable to daily life. Most of us are aware of this to some extent. It floats in the back of our minds whenever we see a tag on our shirt which reads, "Made in Bangladesh." But few of us understand why the system exists or properly understand who benefits from it. For example, most of us assume that these policies benefit little more than multinational corporations and their bottom lines. This is only partly true. In fact, the beneficiaries include the working class of the global north as well. Data from the International Labour Organization can help us examine the scope of the difference in wages between workers in the global north and south respectively. As is evident in this graph, the value of someone's work in the global south is generally a small fraction of the value of labor in the global north. Some viewers might point out that the cost of living is higher in the global north than it is in the global south, but these differences, though lessened, maintain themselves even if we adjust wages for purchasing power parity. If you don't know what purchasing power parity is, it's a method of adjustment to account for cost of living differences. That aside, we will generally be looking at nominal prices rather than those adjusted for purchasing price parity, and you should assume that any figures presented in this video are nominal unless explicitly marked otherwise. This is because it is a better representation of how workers are valued from the perspective of the North when they are purchasing the labor of the South. This is the value of the global South as it appears in the balance sheets of large multinational corporations. This is the value of the global South as it appears in the cost of cheap goods consumed in the global North. We'll soon delve into how these vast differences in value are created and sustained, but for now, Western viewers should ask themselves how such discrepancies can be justified on a moral level to begin with. How can we justify a system which values the work of a laborer in the global North, oftentimes performing the exact same labor as their counterpart in the global South, is more than 10 times more valuable? This becomes even more absurd when we take note of the fact that highly skilled Southern laborers are often paid less than even the minimum wage of global North nations, meaning that the baristas, the call center attendees, and the fast food workers of the global North are often valued more highly in dollar terms than the doctors, engineers, and scientists of the global South. The graph below shows one such comparison. It uses data broken down by skill level provided by the International Labour Organization. For the sake of transparency, let's examine exactly what these definitions of skill levels mean.
The low-skilled workers, colored orange on screen, account for workers classified as ISCO 8 skill level 1.
This is work that, quote, typically requires the performance of simple and routine physical or manual tasks. Examples include office cleaners, freight handlers, garden laborers, and kitchen assistants.
High-skilled workers, displayed in yellow, are an average of skill levels 3 and 4.
Skill level 3 can be described as, quote, typically involving the performance of complex technical and practical tasks which require an extensive body of factual, technical, and procedural knowledge. Examples include medical laboratory technicians, legal secretaries, and computer support technicians. Skill level 4 typically involves the performance of tasks which require complex problem solving and decision making based on an extensive body of theoretical and factual knowledge. Examples include civil engineers, secondary school teachers, and medical practitioners. Once again, these disparities shown below remain even after adjusting for purchasing power parity. Not only does Northern labor receive better wages and benefits, their purchasing power is bolstered by the cheap goods sold in the global North, goods which are only cheap as a result of devalued Southern labor. This stark contrast in the way Northern and Southern labor is valued produces a serious dilemma for workers in the global North who wish to challenge the inequality within their own societies. As economist Tony Norfield writes, do workers in rich countries have any right to complain about the bankers and corporate managers who get high salaries when they themselves enjoy huge benefits from the cheap labor of millions of workers in the third world? Can their protestations be taken seriously? Are they fighting for justice, or do they just want to grab a larger slice of the cake? It is an elementary fact of politics that one cannot fight against exploitation and injustice at home while persistently enjoying the fruits of exploitation and injustice abroad. Before I mention that most of the figures in this video will be nominal rather than adjusted for cost of living. So why is it important to evaluate wages in nominal terms rather than adjusting for purchasing price parity? It's important because that's the price of wages as they appear in the commodities we buy. Nominal wages are therefore the best representation for how workers in different countries are ultimately valued within the context of the global economic system. To illustrate this, let's examine a €4.95 H&M t-shirt made in Bangladesh and sold in Germany. This analysis was performed by the German newspaper Die Zeit and translated by economist Tony Norfield. It helps us understand better the value chain of textiles imported to the north. Whatever the cost of labor is in this t-shirt will be contained within the 95 cents allocated to the Bangladeshi firm that produced the t-shirt. Norfield estimates that the cost of labor is likely just 2 or 3 cents. That would mean that H&M's net profit is 20 to 30 times the remuneration given to Bangladeshi labor. But a shocking revelation is the fact that even more money is appropriated by the German state as tax revenue than is appropriated as profit by H&M. This puts the German state, whose tax dollars finance the social welfare programs which benefit its domestic working classes, as a key beneficiary in the current system of value assignment. But that's not all there is to see here. Notice that nearly $2 are allotted to domestic shipping, rent, retail, marketing, and administration, which represent additional appropriation of value by domestic firms in Germany, including landlords, owners of other businesses, and the wages of German laborers, as well as additional taxes captured by the German state on earnings and income. This simple t-shirt, therefore, represents a grim reality that every one of its kind purchase transfers an incredibly small portion of the purchase price back to the workers whose labor built it, while sending a much larger portion back to the global north, including the working class of the global north. A great deal depends on this breakdown in price. The larger the share which is appropriated by Germany, the smaller the share which is given to Bangladesh. The oversized share which is given to Germany props up its wages, its welfare state, and its standing in the global economy, as represented in statistics such as gross domestic product. Conversely, Bangladeshi wages, working conditions, social welfare, and standing in the world economy are diminished. Again, I would urge viewers from wealthy countries to ask themselves, is this just? It is undoubtedly true that the German workers who transported, managed, and retailed this shirt have contributed something, but have they contributed more than the Bangladeshis who spun the shirt from cotton? It's worth reflecting on this, because in our current globalized economy, we are surrounded by products manufactured overseas. So why is it that so often the majority of the price of these commodities are captured by the global north and not the countries that actually produce them? Of course, the defenders of the existing global economic order are not unaware of this, and they have formulated arguments to defend the current state of affairs. The kind of data on wage inequality that we have examined thus far first began to appear in the 1960s. Mainstream economists were surprised by these results, as it seemed to conflict with widely accepted economic doctrine, which posited that similar goods and services, including wages, would converge to a single price. To explain this contradiction, mainstream economics has essentially argued that such wage inequalities are the result of differences in productivity. This line of thinking is summarized well by a quote from The Economist, a neoliberal magazine based in the UK. They say, "Differences in wages reflect differences in productivity. Low wages in emerging economies go hand in hand with low productivity." This might seem to make sense at first glance. If the workers in the north are, for example, 5 times more productive due to better technology or better training, then it would make sense that their employers would be able to pay them a higher wage. But the productivity argument almost immediately begins to break down when you examine what these economists call non-tradable goods, namely services. As John Smith, an outspoken critic of the dominant position, argues, the vast productivity differences alleged to exist in the tradable goods sector do not exist in the non-tradable sector. There's much less scope for technology-driven productivity differences in the non-tradable goods sector, many services being inherently labor-intensive. It is not easy for mainstream economists to argue that the low wages of bus drivers in Bangladesh go hand in hand with low productivity and keep a straight face. Indeed, if Bangladesh's buses are more crowded, they may well be more productive. To explain wage differentials in the service sector, economists argue that there is a connection between wages in the tradable and non-tradable sector. This, the mainstream argues, is the reason Bangladeshi bus drivers, barbers, and doctors are paid so much less despite there being little or no difference in productivity between them and their counterparts in the global north. All this amounts to a happy story where vast global inequality in wages can be explained away by pointing out that the tradable goods industries of the global north are more productive. However, the problem with explaining away global wage inequality with productivity is that the measured difference in wages between the global north and the global south is far larger than the measured differences in productivity. Before I demonstrate this with data, I want to explain clearly what we mean by productivity. Productivity can be measured in different ways. One way is simply to measure the output of a worker in terms of units of output. So if you have a worker who produces steel, their productivity will be measured in the tons of steel they produce in a given period of time. This raises a problem though when comparing productivity between sectors. How do you compare tons of steel to bushels of wheat, yards of knit cloth, or liters of alcohol? These industries are all different enough to defy direct comparison. The traditional way to get around this is to compare them by the prices at which the final products are sold minus the cost of their inputs. This is also known as value added, since it's the value of the goods produced minus the value of the inputs. However, this measure of output is controversial because the prices of the goods sold by the global north tend to have much higher value added. This is not necessarily because of real differences in productivity, but rather because the global north has something of a monopoly on the highest value sectors of the global economy. Think back to our example with the Bangladeshi t-shirt sold in Germany. Under the given price breakdown, the value-added productivity of German retail workers, transportation drivers, and marketers is much higher than that of the Bangladeshi workers, despite the fact that the actual productive process of creating the shirt all occurred in Bangladesh. The ultimate effect of this is that the true productivity of each side is distorted. Three researchers of labor exploitation, Intan Swandi, Jamil Jonah, and John Bellamy Foster, have proposed a different calculation using gross output rather than value added. In practice, this type of calculation moves the scale of productivity away from value added and closer to the ideal of units produced, which we discussed earlier. These researchers calculate productivity using data from the World Input-Output Database, which contains information for a large number of countries, including data on gross output and wages paid. Using this information, we can perform a calculation which will give us the unit labor cost of laborers in different countries. The unit labor cost is simply the average wage paid to the laborers of a country divided by their productivity measured in gross output. In other words, it measures the wages weighted by productivity. As we can see, the 4 countries chosen from the Global South have consistently lower unit labor costs. This means that even accounting for productivity, the wages paid to the workers of the Global South are consistently lower than those in the Global North. If we adjust the graph so that the unit labor costs are relative to the United States, we can see that with the exception of Indonesia, all 4 of our Global South countries have not exceeded 60% of the US's unit labor costs between 1995 and 2014. This should put to bed the mainstream notion that workers in the Global North are rich because they're simply better or more technologically advanced than their counterparts in the South. They're not more productive. They are simply relatively less exploited. So if productivity differences can't explain the gross inequalities we've already observed, what can? In truth, the answer to this question is multifaceted. To fully explain global wage inequality, one would have to delve into the history of colonialism and its impact on the current day, the international system of passports and borders impeding the free movement of labor, the role of international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the international system of trade law, and more. But for now, I would like to focus on one tendency which you're probably already familiar with, even if you don't know its name: wage arbitrage. Wage arbitrage sits at both ends of global wage inequality, as it is both a result of that inequality, but also serves to reinforce it. To begin, consider that the price of labor is something unique in economic affairs. At least it should be, according to what mainstream economists call the law of one price. This is because if the price at which a commodity is bought and sold in one market is different in another market, that commodity will be the target of speculators, who purchase the commodity cheaper in one market and sell it dearer in another. The pressures of the market thus make these homogeneous commodities converge to a single price. In practice, this is rarely true, but it can often serve as a useful approximation. However, as we have seen, this is not the case with the price of labor. Why should this be so? The answer is largely due to the fact that labor, unlike the aforementioned commodities, cannot move freely through the world market. It's likely that if the laborers of the Global South had the option, they would move to the Global North in droves to enjoy the higher wages and labor rights afforded to workers in the North. But since they cannot, as a result of a global system of immigration controls, the price of labor varies depending on its geographical location. Enter the modern corporation, motivated by the singular imperative of maximizing its own financial gain. It's only natural that this economic actor would seek to minimize its costs, and it finds that it can do so quite profitably through arbitrage of the labor market. Like the speculators of the commodity market, the multinational corporation seeks out the lowest cost of labor in order to sell the product of that labor at a higher rate of profit. However, quite unlike the speculators of the commodity market, this arbitrage does not force the price of labor to a single price. Instead, these price differentials, artificially generated by modern immigration laws and the tremendous violence involved in their enforcement, among other factors, are maintained indefinitely. This is at the core of the current wave of globalization. If you're wondering why northern manufacturing and labor-intensive industries has been moved abroad, the reason is simply that over there production can be carried out cheaper. An instructive example is Nike, the athletic footwear corporation. Nike was based on a business concept authored by its founder Phil Knight. Knight outlined his strategy in a paper titled, "Can Japanese Sports Shoes Do to German Sports Shoes What Japanese Cameras Did to German Cameras?" At the time, sports shoes were predominantly manufactured in Germany. Knight argued that they should be produced in Japan, where wages were lower. Knight put this plan into action in the 1970s, manufacturing shoes in Japan and selling them in the US. Nike, therefore, can be said to have built itself almost entirely around the concept of labor arbitrage from its conception. In the 1970s, Nike faced surging Japanese wages. As Knight recounts in his autobiography, it was all at once in a death spiral against the Japanese yen. Coupled with rising Japanese labor rates, this was now the most imminent threat to our existence. Nike thus moved to greener pastures in Taiwan and South Korea, where labor costs were lower. But after the fall of the dictatorships in Taiwan and South Korea in the late 1980s, wages started to rise. The kind of intense violence against organized labor that these dictatorships had exercised could no longer be maintained. To escape this, Nike shifted production once again. We can see this in the graph, which shows on the one hand the percentage of Nike footwear made in select Asian economies, taken from their 10K filings with the SEC, and on the other hand, minimum wage data for each country from the International Labor Organization. We can see that in 1995, Nike was already shifting production to Thailand, China, and Indonesia due to their lower wages. We see that around 2004, Nike began shifting its production out of Thailand. Again, you can clearly see in the data that Thailand at this time had a higher minimum wage than Indonesia, China, and Vietnam, the countries which Nike would keep its production in. Then around 2011, we see that Nike's production in China starts to decline as Chinese wages rise above those in Vietnam and Indonesia. As of 2020, more than 50% of Nike's footwear production is in Vietnam, a country with a lower minimum wage than China. The picture that emerges is crystal clear. For Nike, wherever the cost of labor is rock bottom is where they will move their production. Raising the example of Nike is not meant to give you the idea that Nike is uniquely greedy or evil. Nike's behavior is simply what one can expect from any institution whose sole objective is to maximize profits. Nike's behavior is therefore representative of the general trend of wage arbitrage among northern firms. It is the fundamental axis on which modern capitalist globalization has been built, by outsourcing labor-intensive processes to the global south, and furthermore, by shifting these processes continuously between southern nations based on the price of labor. Northern firms create a ruinous system of mutual competition among southern economies, producing what can only be described as a race to the bottom. In summary, global inequality has created two worlds: that of the global north, a haven of relatively high standards for wages and labor rights, and the south, where wages are relentlessly suppressed. For those of us who are of the working class and live in the north, this presents a dilemma. On the one hand, no person wishes to see their own privilege diminished, but on the other hand, privilege that is born of a gross injustice should be morally intolerable. Ultimately, there is only one working class, and the laborers of both the North and the South are a part of it. International capital has divided us in two, with the intention of playing us off of each other. They know that under the system they have created, a rise in the wages and working rights of the global South will equate to inflation and a diminishment of real wages in the North. The only counter-strategy to this division is solidarity. The workers of the global North and South must strengthen their ties. We must learn to look at the plight of workers in the South not simply as unfortunate events in far-flung lands, but as attacks on ourselves, as members of the same global working class. The global owning class seems impossibly well organized, and the institutions of workers' power weak and fractured by comparison. By extending true solidarity to the workers of the global South, by protesting their treatment at the hands of the industries of the global North, we can begin to build the bonds of trust between these two worlds and initiate the process of building a truly organized and powerful global working class.
Thank you for watching my video. If you would like to see more of my work, please make sure to like and subscribe. If you would like to support my future videos, please join my Patreon, where you will be able to view my future work 1 week in advance of its general release on YouTube. This was my first video, but it will not be my last. I have so much more that I want to say.